Greetings. This is my solo podcast on the HBO series Chernobyl, which is based on the Chernobyl disaster of the 26th of April, 1986. This disaster, uh, as we should know by now, is the worst nuclear-related disaster in human history. We we as a human race never experienced this kind of disaster because what happened as a result is that it released a lot of radiation across Central Europe, East Europe, and even Scandinavia. It was well within the risk of irradiating the entire northern hemisphere if it continued longer than it did. Luckily, now it's only contained within a exclusion zone which is just a small portion of the countryside of Bulgaria and Ukraine. But the fact is that that area will be irradiated for hundreds of thousands of years, or roughly that amount of time. So in this podcast, I will explain briefly each episode, and I'll also mention some of the artistic liberties and some of the facts that the show omitted. It did do its research. It stuck to as much as it could to the truth, but it didn't get all of it right. So, episode 1 starts off with the initial reactions. The plant plant workers don't really agree on what actually happened, which is that the core exploded. The firefighters were sent in to deal with the supposed fire, and that the first people start dropping to the radiation as the morning came along. It happened at midnight, 12 12:34, around 56 seconds. In this episode, I'll touch on a few things. First is that the supposed fire, was not actually a legit inferno type of fire. The fire itself was relatively small, if not even existent. The firefighters did come in and respond and did what they knew, which is to spray water from wherever the smoke is coming out, and to assist whatever they can with the people who are victims in the area. And uh, so this runs contrary to the massive inferno that was presented in the show. Also, the firefighters themselves were not exactly fully equipped, not in the sense of for radiation, but even for normal firefighter work. Like, some of them didn't come in with full firefighter gear. Some of them had partial civilian wear. Some of them didn't have helmets, or some of them didn't have the firefighter coats and stuff. So they were even more exposed to the radiation. Also, Valery Legasov, the protagonist of the story, who led much of the work in regards to dealing with the disaster itself. It is said that he killed himself on the second anniversary of the disaster. In truth, though, he actually killed himself a day after the second anniversary of the disaster. This is chalked up to a bit of an error on the part of the director or the series crew. So at least they got it close. So that means his death is at the April 27th, 1988. Also, another topic that I'll touch on later is Dyatlov. I'm basing some of my facts on the statements and testimonies of witnesses and victims, and they specifically say that Anatoly Dyatlov, reactor director of reactor number 4, was not as bad as the show presented. Well, no, anyway, Moving on to chapter 2 is where the morning comes up, and the scope of the disaster is starting to show itself. The firefighters and plant workers are clearly irradiated. The information has been limited by the board of directors and management of the nuclear plant itself. Hospital is under equipped to deal with radiation poisoning. And in the morning, in this new morning, the Valery Legasov tells Mikhail Gorbachev that the situation is far worse. It's affecting the area for more longer than their own lifespan. So he convinces Gorbachev to let him go to the site and assess what is to be done. And he gets this permission, but with the company of Boris Sherbina. So and they assess the disaster itself to be really really bad, despite the words of the board of management, such as Byukhanov and Fomin, respectively. Respectively, Fomin himself is a chief engineer, while Byukhanov is oh yeah, Byukhanov is a plant director. Sorry about that. Anyway, in this episode, we're also introduced to Ulana Komyuk, who hails from Kiev and has detected the radiation spike, and she herself went to the site to to provide her knowledge of radiation to the efforts of dealing with the disaster. They also quickly learned that under Dyatlov's management, the plant basement was flooded. After all, Dyatlov decided that it was not that the core exploded; it's just that some sort of leak just happened, and they have to use water to cool down the radiation. So it's quickly concluded that that if the reactor melts down even more, it will cause a steam explosion as it melts down towards the basement filled with water. So they looked to the plant workers and found three volunteers: Ananenko, Bezpalov, and Baranov. Okay, for some artistic liberties, they did take an actual helicopter crash that did happen as they presented, but in in reality, though, it happened 6 months later. So instead of being in the morning after, it happened around 6 months later. But it did happen exactly as how they presented it. Also, the three supposed volunteers, Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov, weren't exactly volunteers. They were said that they had to do it, and they were the most willing. They themselves even treated the whole job as their work. After all, in their knowledge, they are just the plant workers, and this is just their job. So they went down and drained the basement just because it's their job, and they didn't even get much of a reward or celebration, contrary to what the series presented. So, as of today, two of them are still alive, and they and even the third, who unfortunately died earlier than the two, managed to give their words, and their testimonies shed quite a bit of light to this story. So episode 3 is dealing with the effects of radiation poisoning, and the truth itself. You see, the disaster itself, even to this day, has a lot of mystery behind it as to who did what and how did these things happen because of that. But it is clear that radiation poisoning killed a lot of people. In terms of radiation poisoning, we see this through the couple named Vasily and Lyudmila Ignatenko. Lyudmila is pregnant with their daughter, and Vasily, as a firefighter, was irradiated due to the disaster. So, we see the effects of radiation as his body slowly degraded from body-wide rashes to extreme pain, then bodily wilting, then pigment changing from pale to rotting yellow. But in reality, the process takes longer and is more visceral. Like your skin will start sloughing off at some point. This is actually seen. This is actually seen on some plant workers as well. And these plant workers, Toptanov and Akimov, who were actually leading plant workers under Dyatlov, were supposedly interviewed by Ulana Komyuk, but they were indeed irradiated, but in much worse state than what they were presented as. She learns from the two of them that that Akimov was told to initiate an emergency shutdown, which is a really new concept at the time and was really unprecedented. Therefore, it shows the scope of how much we didn't really know back then, and it took something like Chernobyl to knock some sense as to the dangers of radiation. Also, the KGB shows up in episode 3, and it is here that I'll touch on the reaction of Russia. In truth, I didn't really like it. This show, it showed too many cliches, too many Russian stereotypes that is viewed really negatively. Like they didn't celebrate with vodka, they didn't have KGB everywhere. Even the amount of common treatment in the show because of Soviets was not actually true as well, because Soviets actually still had an hierarchy. It's just that it's more closely related to socialism rather than full on equality. This after Stalinism, so they did fix some of the authoritism in the system, but still there was hierarchy. But at least it's in their eyes, in the words of the testimonies, they were more fair hierarchies. Anyway, so the episode 3 ends. No, actually, I just remembered the story. The miners in the episode 3 were actually real. They actually had to dig a tunnel underneath nuclear reactor number 4 because it is in this episode that it's experiencing a meltdown already, and they had to keep it from leaking into the Baltic Sea, which they successfully did thanks thanks to their quick thinking and to the miners' knowledge of doing tunnels. But in truth, is that they didn't strip naked at some point. There was no nakedness. So the show's presentation is mostly accurate except the nakedness. And thus the story ends with Vasily Ignatenko's funeral. He and like several others, and this is true in several cases, they are given special arrangements and treatment for burial. Their bodies were really irradiated, so they had to be buried in steel welded caskets. These caskets made out of steel coffins that were welded together and were buried underneath cement, wet cement. And even today, if you were to have a tour in Chernobyl, one of the particularly radiated sites places in the exclusion zone is a burial site where a lot of these types of cement burials did happen. On to episode 4. Episode 4 is where the actual cleanup is the scale of the actual cleanup is visited upon. They had to they had to spray the streets of Chernobyl. They had to tear up the soil and bury it underneath itself, the forests, the fields, the farmlands. And while it was not shown in the series, they did also have to bury any loose metals, any irradiated materials with all that soil. So cars were buried, metals were buried. Only the things that were too big to be buried were left on the surface. And you could see this as the fair, the Chernobyl Fun Fair that was left along with many other things in the exclusion zone. The Ferris wheel, the its bumper cars, and among other things. It's one of the more popular sites in Chernobyl now. There was also the cleanup of all the leftover pets. They had to kill them, they had to cull them, including the wildlife. Anything that could run around while it's irradiated was killed. And they also had to search if there was any people left. And probably not in the scale as the show presented, but they did scour the supposed exclusion zone, the perimeter of Chernobyl for now, of any living things, as particularly animals. The way they did deal with the pets, though, the animals, was not as the show presented. The soldiers and others who could lend their firearms, their skill to hunting down the pets, were didn't do it in the means that the show presented. While the testimonies were not 100% clear on that, the truth of the fact is that theirs were more ordered, and those partaking in the cleanups were more protected. Another scene, though, the use of robots and rovers was accurate for the graphite on the roof. The graphite itself was not all broken rectangular bricks of graphite, but more of piles of pebbles and rocks. And it is also true that the Germans sent a police robot, but that didn't work. So they had to send actual human robots, where they sent liquidators up. And contrary to reality, these liquidators did not get any reward or compensation. They went up there for 90 seconds to clear up all the graphite on the roof. They had to do it in shifts, and each shift was 90 seconds, or else your lifespan is cut in half or even less. So the show in episode 4 did show the proper scale of the cleanup, but it did leave out some things because that would be already tedious, because they would have to gather a lot of cars, and that would make a lot of problems in production. Anyway, moving on to episode 5, the actual trial involving the Soviet government, a lot of professionals in the radiation, a jury, a judge, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the eyes of much of the world, West and East, and even the neutral side of the world. The trial is more or less against the it's more or less meant to see if three people were at fault for the disaster. These are Anatoly Dyatlov, Bryukhanov, and Fomin. I mentioned these three earlier, and Dyatlov as the testimonies say was actually the best of the three of them. The show presents him as a negligent, arrogant, and ignorant individual. He he directly disregarded any idea that the core would explode, and disregarded any form of sensibility, just saying that that's just this thing. It's normal. So in reality, though, he was more fair. He was ignorant, but that is because that the scale is not was not comprehensible at the time. No one could imagine that kind of thing happening. The whole core exploding, and the northern hemisphere being irradiated for thousands and thousands of years. And there was also the situation of the Cold War. You can't just say anything in this type of situation, because it's either your government gets mad or the people get mad. Soviets will be mad because you just made the Soviet Union look very weak and ignorant, while you might get the people mad because you're not giving enough. So Dyatlov was really put in a tight situation. Also, one this scene specifically says that the government did use lead tips, which made the disaster happen. Um, it said this, and it's that did happen. But unfortunately, it is one of the reasons that the Russians didn't really like it either, because it made them look like particularly callous and more or less stupid in regards of dealing with radiation. So the Russians still did not like that. So the trial results in Dyatlov, Bryukhanov, and Fomin getting 5 years or so of hard labor just to deal with their mistakes and accidents. Fomin did get his new job in another nuclear site, and among all the other truths that were given at the end, the Bridge of Death was actually an urban legend, not reality. It's more of an urban legend. After all, like, stories come around and around, but the victims say that they didn't hear anything about any Bridge of Death, and they specifically say that that particular bridge, as they know, infected only one person, some biker who was biking along when the disaster occurred. So that's as far as the victims know of what happened on that bridge. Vasily Legasov, in the end of this story, though, in the end of this series, was more or less put under house arrest, told to keep quiet by the KGB, and that he would get no recompense, no renown, no recognition for anything that he'd done on that place, because he more or less because to the KGB and to what they could spend, Gasov probably was lying. That This is my conjecture on how the KGB was going to deal with silencing someone like Legasov, but his suicide did help in retrofitting all the reactors and to clean up the disaster and to prevent the Chernobyl. As of today, there's now a sarcophagus, but unfortunately, recently it was said that the sarcophagus is having issues and they're having to fix it before it crumbles in upon itself. So we'll have to hope that does not happen. This was my solo podcast, and let it be remembered that this show was probably the most truth we'll get out of the Chernobyl disaster, aside from all the documents and testimonies. It did its research and did its job well. All we can hope for is for the sarcophagus to hold up even more as it's having issues today, and for nothing else to happen like this ever again.